The frozen fields of Alsace, France, stretch endlessly under a pewter sky, their surface broken only by the jagged stumps of trees shattered by artillery fire. Snow lies 3 feet deep in places, stained here and there with the rust-colored evidence of recent violence. The date is January 26, 1945, and across this desolate landscape, something impossible is about to unfold, a single moment that will redefine the very limits of human courage under fire. Through the smoke and chaos of battle, witnesses would later struggle to comprehend what they saw. A lone American soldier, barely weighing more than 100 pounds, standing atop a burning tank destroyer, systematically destroying an entire German company's advance. The elite mountain troops of the 2nd Gebirgsdivision veterans, specially transferred from the frozen hell of Norway for this crucial offensive war, being stopped cold by what appeared to be little more than a boy. Behind German lines, 6 tanks and tank destroyers that had crushed Allied resistance across 3 countries sat immobilized, their commanders too shocked to advance without the infantry support that was being methodically cut down before their eyes. The mathematics of warfare, as understood by every military academy in the world, said this was impossible. 250 seasoned German mountain infantry, supported by armored vehicles and artillery, against 40 exhausted Americans in hastily prepared positions. The outcome should have been decided in minutes. Instead, for one impossible hour, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy would rewrite the fundamental rules of warfare itself, proving that sometimes the human spirit can transcend every tactical manual ever written. This is not just a story about one battle or even one war. It's an exploration of what happens when an ordinary person faces the extraordinary and discovers reserves of strength they never knew existed. Before we dive deeper into this incredible tale of courage that changed military history forever, take a moment to subscribe if you love diving into the most remarkable stories history has to offer, and tell me in the comments what city you re-watching from. I love hearing from viewers around the world who share this passion for uncovering the truth behind legendary moments. But to understand how one young Texan could accomplish the impossible on a frozen battlefield in France, we must first journey back to the cotton fields of Hunt County, Texas, where poverty and hardship forged the man who would become America's most decorated soldier. The Great Depression had settled over East Texas like a suffocating blanket, and nowhere was its grip tighter than in the sharecropper communities, where survival depended on cotton prices and the mercy of landowners. Into this world of crushing poverty and limited horizons, Audie Murphy was born on June 20, 1925, the 6th of 12 children in a family that knew hunger as an intimate companion. The Murphy homestead, if it could be called that, was a ramshackle collection of wooden buildings that provided little shelter from either the scorching Texas summers or the bitter winter winds that swept across the plains. Emmett Murphy, Audie's father, was a sharecropper whose relationship with both the land and his family grew increasingly strained as economic pressures mounted. The cotton that should have provided sustenance instead became a symbol of their trapped existence. Endless rows of white that demanded back-breaking labor in exchange for barely enough to survive. Young Audie learned early that survival required skills most children never needed to develop, while other boys his age might have been playing games or attending school regularly. Audie was mastering the art of putting food on the family table. His weapon of choice was a .22 caliber rifle, worn and temperamental, that had seen better days long before it came into his small hands. Every bullet represented a precious investment of resources the family could ill afford to waste. "If I don't hit what I shoot at, my family doesn't eat tonight," Audie confided to his neighbor, Monroe Hackney, explaining with the matter-of-fact precision of a child forced to grow up too quickly. The pressure was relentless and unforgiving. In the hard-scrabble world of Depression-era Texas, marksmanship was a hobby, or a sport. Tit was the difference between a family meal and empty stomachs around a bare table. The boy's natural ability with firearms soon became legendary throughout Hunt County. Local farmers would pause in their work to watch the slight figure moving through the underbrush, rifle at the ready, stalking prey with the patience and skill of someone twice his age. Audie could drop a running rabbit at 50 yards with the worn .22 rifle that most grown men couldn't hit a barn wall with. Each shot had to count, not just because ammunition cost money they didn't have, but because missing meant facing the disappointed faces of hungry siblings back home. This crucible of poverty and responsibility was shaping more than just Audie's marksmanship. It was developing a mental discipline, a capacity for calm under pressure, and an understanding that sometimes survival depends on doing what seems impossible. These lessons, learned in the cotton fields and pine forests of East Texas, would prove invaluable on the battlefields of Europe, though young Audie had no way of knowing that his difficult childhood was preparing him for a very different kind of survival challenge. The Murphy family's precarious situation became catastrophic when Emmett Murphy abandoned his family in 1937, leaving 12-year-old Audie without a father figure and increasing the burden on every member of the household. The reasons for Emmett's departure were complex economic desperation, the overwhelming responsibility of feeding so many mouths, and perhaps the crushing weight of watching his children suffer despite his efforts. Whatever the cause, his absence left a void that young Audie began filling with a determination that seemed far beyond his years. 4 years later, when Audie was just 16, his mother Josie died of endocarditis and pneumonia, diseases that might have been treatable with proper medical care but proved fatal in a family that could afford doctors. Her death marked the end of Audie's childhood in any conventional sense. At an age when most teenagers are worried about homework and social relationships, Audie became the primary provider for his younger siblings, carrying a responsibility that would have crushed many adults. The skills he had developed hunting for the family table now took on even greater significance. His ability to move silently through terrain, to remain motionless for hours while waiting for the perfect shot, to make snap decisions under pressure, all of these would translate directly to the requirements of infantry combat. But perhaps most importantly, Audie had learned that sometimes you have to do the impossible simply because there's no alternative, and that failure isn't an option when people you love are depending on you. When news of the Pearl Harbor attack reached rural Texas on December 7, 1941, 16-year-old Audie Murphy saw more than a national tragedy. He saw an opportunity. The military represented everything his current life lacked: steady pay, 3 meals a day, and the chance to send money home to support his siblings. But even joining the service would prove challenging for the undersized teenager who looked years younger than his actual age. Standing just 5 feet, 5 inches tall and weighing barely 110 pounds, Audie was rejected first by the Marines, then by the Navy, both services concluding he was simply too small for military duty. The Army paratroopers, despite their reputation for accepting men other branches might overlook, also turned him away. It seemed that even in wartime, when the military was desperate for recruits, Audie Murphy was considered unsuitable for service. Finally, the regular Army infantry agreed to accept him, but only after his sister Corinne provided a falsified affidavit claiming he was 18 years old, the minimum age for enlistment. On June 30, 1942, Private Audie Murphy raised his right hand and took the oath that would transform him from a poverty-stricken Texas farm boy into what would eventually become the most decorated soldier in American military history. The irony would not be lost on military historians decades later. The services that had rejected Murphy as too small and weak had failed to recognize that his diminutive stature masked an inner strength forged by years of hardship and responsibility. The boy who had learned to hunt out of necessity, who had shouldered adult responsibilities while still a child, who had never known the luxury of failure, was about to enter a world where those exact qualities would make the difference between life and death. Private First Class David "Mouse" McCruer, who went through basic training with Murphy at Camp Walters, Texas, later recalled the immediate impression the young recruit made on his fellow soldiers. "We all thought he was a mascot at first," McCruer remembered with the clarity that comes from witnessing something truly extraordinary. This kid who looked about 14 and weighed nothing. The drill sergeants rode him mercilessly, called him baby, and worse things. Most of us expected him to wash out in the first week. But there was something about Murphy that became apparent only when he was on the rifle range. When he was shooting, McCruer continued, those baby blue eyes went cold as winter. He never missed, not once. The drill instructors would call out impossible targets, thinking they could break his confidence, but he'd just nod and put a bullet exactly where they said. After about the third day, nobody called him baby anymore. The transformation Murphy underwent during basic training represented more than just military conditioning. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by men who had also known hardship, who understood that survival sometimes required doing what others thought impossible. The military structure provided something he had never experienced, a system where competence mattered more than size, where performance trumped appearance, where the skills he had learned in desperate circumstances were not just valued, but essential. His instructors began to recognize that Murphy possessed an unusual combination of attributes that could not be taught in any manual. His rural upbringing had taught him to move silently, to use terrain for concealment, to remain perfectly still for extended periods. His hunting experience had developed his marksmanship to an almost supernatural level. Most importantly, his difficult childhood had created a mental toughness, an ability to function under pressure that would prove invaluable in combat. As Murphy completed his training and prepared for deployment overseas, few could have predicted that this slight young man from Texas would soon face challenges that would test every skill he had learned, every lesson hardship had taught him. The cotton fields of Hunt County had been his first classroom in survival, but the battlefields of Europe would provide a graduate education in courage that would ultimately change not just military history, but our understanding of what human beings are capable of when everything they value is at stake. The stage was set for an extraordinary journey that would take a poverty-stricken farm boy from the depths of the Great Depression to the heights of military valor. But first, that boy would have to survive his introduction to warfare in some of the most brutal campaigns of World War II. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 marked Audie Murphy's baptism by fire and the beginning of his transformation from trained soldier to legendary warrior. Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, hit the beaches at Lacarda as part of General George S. Patton's 7th Army, tasked with establishing a foothold on European soil for the first time since the dark days following Pearl Harbor. The landing itself was chaotic, marked by the confusion and terror that characterized amphibious assaults, but for Murphy, it represented something he had been unconsciously preparing for his entire life. Sicily, in 1943, was a landscape scarred by centuries of conquest and occupation. Its ancient hills now serving as defensive positions for German and Italian forces determined to make the Allied advance as costly as possible. The terrain was perfect for defense: rocky highlands, honeycombed with caves and ancient fortifications, valleys that became killing fields, and a network of small towns that could be turned into fortresses with minimal preparation. For an attacker, every advance meant exposing yourself to enemy fire from multiple directions. Every hill climbed could be your last. Murphy's first real combat experience came in the mountains near Palermo, where Company B found itself pinned down by a German machine gun position that had already cost them several casualties. The situation was desperate. They couldn't advance. They couldn't retreat, and every minute they remained exposed meant more American soldiers would die. It was the kind of tactical problem that military academies used as examples of why infantry attacks without proper support usually failed. But Murphy saw something his officers had missed. His years of hunting in the East Texas woodlands had taught him to think like prey and predator simultaneously, to see terrain not as an obstacle but as a tool. While his comrades focused on the machine gun nest directly ahead, Murphy studied the landscape around it, identifying a route that would allow him to approach from the side, where the Germans would not expect an attack. What happened next would be recounted in after-action reports and remembered by survivors for decades. Murphy worked his way round the enemy position with the patience and skill of a hunter stalking dangerous game. He moved from cover to cover, utilizing shadows and terrain features that others might have overlooked, until he was within grenade range of the German position. The attack itself was swift and decisive: grenades to suppress the position, followed by accurate rifle fire to eliminate the surviving crew members. But Murphy didn't stop there. Recognizing that the machine gun could be turned against retreating German forces, he quickly familiarized himself with the weapon and used it to cut down enemy soldiers attempting to fall back to secondary positions. His actions not only eliminated the immediate threat, but turned a defensive disaster into an offensive opportunity, allowing Company B to advance and secure their objective. Captain Paul Harris recommended Murphy for the Bronze Star, writing in his citation, "This soldier displays a natural aptitude for combat that is extraordinary in one so young and inexperienced." The words, though measured in the careful language of military bureaucracy, hinted at something remarkable. Murphy hadn't just followed training or executed a plan. He had improvised, adapted, and succeeded in a situation where conventional tactics had failed. The Sicily campaign revealed aspects of Murphy's character that would define his combat career. Unlike many soldiers who fought with passion or anger, Murphy approached combat with what his comrades would later describe as cold calculation. Staff Sergeant William Polson, who served with Murphy throughout the Italian campaign, observed, "Murph didn't fight angry. That's what was terrifying about him. He fought cold, calculated, like he was doing arithmetic. See a German, eliminate the German, move to the next German. No emotion, no hesitation, just deadly efficiency." This methodical approach to combat was both Murphy's greatest strength and, perhaps, the source of the psychological wounds he would carry for the rest of his life. The boy who had learned to hunt rabbits to feed his family had discovered he was exceptionally good at hunting human beings, and the transition from necessity-driven survival to warfare created internal conflicts that would haunt him long after the shooting stopped. The Italian mainland campaign that followed Sicily intensified both the physical and psychological pressures on American forces. The German defense of Italy was masterfully planned and brutally executed, taking advantage of terrain that seemed designed by nature to favor defenders. Every river crossing, every mountain pass, every approach to a town or city became the site of fierce battles that cost both sides heavily in men and materiel. At the Volturno River crossing, in October 1943, Murphy's squad was decimated by a German counterattack that caught him in the open during what should have been a routine river crossing. Murphy found himself alone with a borrowed sniper rifle, facing German infantry advancing in overwhelming numbers. What followed became the stuff of military legend. Murphy killed 5 German soldiers at ranges exceeding 300 yards, each shot placed with the precision of a master marksman, effectively stopping the counterattack and allowing surviving American forces to regroup and establish defensive positions. For this action, Murphy received the Distinguished Service Cross, but more importantly, he began to develop a reputation among both American and German forces as someone to be feared. Word spread through the informal networks that connect all armies. Murphy was marked as a sniper of exceptional skill, a small figure who could appear anywhere and deliver death with mechanical precision. The psychological impact of Murphy's combat effectiveness extended beyond simple tactical considerations. German forces, particularly veteran units that had fought across multiple theaters, began to develop what intelligence reports described as an unhealthy preoccupation with avoiding areas where Murphy's unit was known to be operating. This wasn't just tactical caution, it represented a fundamental challenge to German assumptions about American fighting capability. Nazi propaganda had consistently portrayed American soldiers as soft, undisciplined, and lacking the martial virtues that supposedly made German forces superior. The reality of facing someone like Murphy, a young American who fought with skill, determination, and an apparent immunity to fear, created cognitive dissonance that went beyond military considerations and challenged core beliefs about cultural and racial superiority that underpinned Nazi ideology. Anzio, That blood-soaked beachhead that Winston Churchill famously called the Wildcat represented Murphy's full maturation as a combat soldier. The battle for Anzio was unlike anything American forces had previously experienced, a prolonged siege where every position was known to the enemy, where artillery fire was constant, and where the difference between life and death often came down to split-second decisions and individual acts of extraordinary courage. Murphy earned his first Silver Star at Anzio for destroying a German tank with a bazooka at point-blank range, an action that required not just courage but precise timing and an understanding of armored vehicle vulnerabilities that most infantry soldiers never developed. The citation read like something from a tactical manual, but survivors of the action knew they had witnessed something far beyond standard military procedure. By the time of the invasion of southern France in August 1944, Murphy had survived Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and Rome. He had been wounded twice, decorated multiple times, and had developed a combat record that was already remarkable by any standard. More importantly, he had evolved from a skilled individual soldier into a combat leader capable of inspiring others to perform beyond their perceived limitations. When his lieutenant was killed in an ambush near Montélimar during the drive through southern France, Sergeant Murphy didn't hesitate to take command of the platoon. Facing a German company of over 100 men with just 18 Americans, Murphy organized a defense that held a critical crossroads for 2 hours while personally accounting for 15 enemy casualties. His leadership during this engagement earned him a battlefield commission to second lieutenant on October 14, 1944. The promotion represented more than just military advancement. It marked Murphy's transformation from exceptional individual soldier to combat leader. His men followed him not because of his rank, but because they had witnessed his competence under fire and understood that serving under Murphy significantly improved their chances of surviving the war. This loyalty would prove crucial in the trials that lay ahead, particularly during the desperate winter fighting in the Colmar Pocket, where Murphy would face his greatest test. As 1944 drew to a close, Murphy was no longer the baby-faced recruit who had struggled to meet enlistment standards. Combat had aged him beyond his 19 years, carved lines in his face that spoke of experiences no teenager should endure, and created internal wounds that would never fully heal. He had seen most of his original companions killed or wounded, had personally killed over 100 enemy soldiers, and had earned a reputation as one of the most effective small unit leaders in the American Army. But the hardest test still lay ahead. Winter was approaching, and with it the final German offensive in the West that would determine whether the Reich could extend the war into 1946 or whether Allied forces would break through to the German heartland. The Colmar Pocket, that last German foothold west of the Rhine, would become the stage for Murphy's greatest triumph and the action that would establish his place in military history forever. The boy from Texas who had learned to hunt out of necessity was about to face an opponent unlike any he had encountered before. German mountain troops who had never known defeat, supported by armor and fighting on ground of their own choosing. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge every assumption about what was possible in warfare and demonstrate that sometimes individual courage can overcome seemingly impossible odds. January 1945 found the Western Front locked in a deadly stalemate that belied the optimistic predictions of Allied commanders who had hoped to end the war by Christmas. The failure of Operation Market Garden, the savage fighting in the Hurtgen forest, and the shock of the Battle of the Bulge had demonstrated that Nazi Armada, though clearly losing the war, retained the capability to inflict enormous casualties on Allied forces. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the Colmar Pocket, an 850-square-mile German bridgehead west of the Rhine River that represented the last piece of French soil under Wehrmacht control. Hitler's decision to hold the Colmar Pocket at all costs was both strategic and psychological. Strategically, it provided a launching point for potential counterattacks and tied down Allied forces that might otherwise be used for the final assault into Germany. Psychologically, It represented German determination to contest every foot of ground, to make the Allies pay such a price for victory that they might consider negotiating a settlement rather than pursuing unconditional surrender. The German forces defending the pocket were among the finest remaining units in the Wehrmacht. The 2nd Mountain Division, specially trained for winter combat in Norway, had been transferred specifically for this operation. These were not the hastily trained replacements or war-weary veterans that characterized much of the German army in 1945. They were elite troops, well-equipped, well-led, and fighting with the desperation of soldiers who knew they were making their last stand. For Company B, 3rd Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, the approach to Holtzwihr represented the culmination of a campaign that had already cost them dearly. In 5 days of fighting leading up to January 26th, they had lost 102 men wounded, and all officers except Murphy killed or evacuated. From a full-strength company of 187 men, they were down to just 40 effectives, a reduction in strength that would normally result in a unit being withdrawn from combat for reconstitution. But the tactical situation didn't allow for withdrawal. Company B held positions along the edge of the Badweiler forest, overlooking nearly a mile of open ground that led to the German-held village of Holtzwihr. This terrain was crucial. Whoever controlled the forest edge could dominate the approaches to Holtzwihr, and whoever controlled Holtzwihr controlled access to the road networks that supplied the entire German position in the southern portion of the Colmar Pocket. Murphy had positioned his depleted company as best the terrain allowed. 2 M10 tank destroyers provided his only significant anti-tank capability, positioned where they could engage German armor crossing the open ground. His infantry, spread dangerously thin along the woodline, occupied hastily prepared positions that provided minimal protection from the bitter cold and incoming artillery fire. Murphy established his command post in a drainage ditch that offered some protection while providing observation over the likely German approach routes. The conditions his men endured during the days leading up to the attack represented warfare at its most brutal. Private Anthony Abramsky, one of the survivors, later described their situation with the stark honesty of someone who had witnessed hell firsthand. "We were finished, done. Most of us hadn't slept in 3 days. We'd been living on cold rations when we could eat at all. Half the guys had frostbite. Our machine guns were freezing up. We tried all night to dig foxholes, but the ground was like iron." The physical challenges were compounded by psychological stress that pushed men to the breaking point. They had watched their company be systematically destroyed over the course of less than a week. Friends they had served with for months or years were gone killed, wounded, or evacuated with injuries that ended their war. The survivors found themselves in positions they had never trained for, carrying responsibilities that should have been distributed among twice their number. Murphy himself was fighting wounded, though he had told no one about the shrapnel wound in his leg received 2 days earlier. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it was painful and limiting, affecting his mobility at a time when he needed to be everywhere at once, checking positions, coordinating with supporting units, and maintaining the morale of men who had every reason to believe they were going to die. January 26th dawned gray and bitter cold, with temperatures hovering around freezing and a wind that cut through the heaviest overcoats like they were tissue paper. Snow lay 3 feet deep in places, though constant artillery fire had churned much of the battlefield into a moonscape of frozen mud and ice. The landscape looked like something from the end of the world, trees reduced to jagged stumps. Buildings collapsed into rubble, the white snow stained with the evidence of recent violence. The German attack began at 1300 hours, with an artillery barrage that demonstrated both the enemy's remaining strength and their determination to break Company B's resistance. Tree-burst shells designed to explode in the treetops and shower defenders with deadly fragments for 30 minutes. The psychological impact of tree bursts was as important as their physical effect. They created a constant rain of death that could penetrate even well-prepared positions and left defenders feeling helpless and exposed. Murphy's first indication that the attack was beginning came from his forward observers, who reported movement in the German positions across the open ground. Private First Class Donald Ekman was the first to spot the approaching force. You could see the pennants on the antennas of the German tanks, 6 of them spread out in attack formation, and behind them, Jesus Christ, there must have been 250 infantry, all in white snow camouflage, moving across that field like ghosts. The tactical situation Murphy faced was a textbook example of why defensive positions were supposed to be held by at least twice the number of men he had available. The Germans were attacking with overwhelming numerical superiority, supported by armor, and advancing across ground that offered little cover for defenders. Military doctrine suggested that Company B's position should be overrun within minutes of the German assault reaching their lines. Murphy's first response was to call for artillery support from the divisional batteries positioned several miles to the rear. Artillery was his only hope of evening the odds, but artillery alone wouldn't stop a determined attack by forces of this size. The Germans were advancing in proper assault formation, armor leading, infantry following, in dispersed groups that would be difficult to target effectively with area weapons. At 600 yards, Company B's 2 M10 tank destroyers opened fire, their 3-inch guns representing the only weapons capable of stopping German armor at long range. The first shots missed, not surprising given that the crews were exhausted, cold-numbed, and operating vehicles that had been in continuous combat for days without proper maintenance. The German return fire was immediate and devastating. An 88mm shell from one of the German tanks struck the rear M10 squarely in the turret, the impact creating an explosion that could be heard miles away. The tank destroyer burst into flames, its fuel and ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions that sent debris flying in all directions. The crew, those who survived the initial hit, scrambled out and ran for the relative safety of the woods, abandoning their vehicle and its weapons. The forward M10, attempting to maneuver for a better firing position, encountered the fundamental problem facing all armored vehicles in winter warfare: frozen ground that provided no traction for tracks designed to operate in more favorable conditions. The tank destroyer slid sideways into a drainage ditch, its tracks spinning uselessly as the driver desperately tried to extract the vehicle from its predicament. Unable to move or elevate its gun to engage the approaching German armor, the crew had no choice but to abandon their vehicle and retreat to the woodline. At approximately 14:20 hours, with both tank destroyers out of action and German infantry closing to within 200 yards, Murphy faced the decision that would define not only his military career but his entire life. Standard tactical doctrine called for a fighting withdrawal to prepared secondary positions, an orderly retreat that would preserve his remaining men for future operations. Murphy ordered his soldiers to fall back to positions in the woods, but he made a decision that defied every principle of military science. He wouldn't retreat with them. Instead, Murphy ran through the artillery fire to the burning M10 tank destroyer, the very vehicle that had been struck by German fire and was now fully engulfed in flames. The rear section, where the 88mm shell had struck, was a mass of twisted metal and roaring fire. Black smoke poured from the hull, and the heat was so intense it could be felt from 30 feet away. At any moment, the remaining ammunition stored in the vehicle could detonate, turning the tank destroyer into a massive bomb that would kill anyone in the vicinity. Murphy climbed onto this burning vehicle and manned its .50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun. From this elevated position, he had a clear field of fire across the approaching German formations. But he was also completely exposed, single figure, silhouetted against the sky with no cover except the smoke from the burning vehicle beneath him. He had transformed himself into the most visible target on the battlefield, drawing the attention of every German weapon within range. The M2 Browning was one of the finest heavy machine guns ever designed, capable of firing 550 rounds per minute with an effective range of 2,000 meters. In skilled hands, it was a weapon of devastating effectiveness, but it was also heavy, difficult to control. and generated tremendous recoil that had to be absorbed by the operator. Murphy would have to maintain his balance on an unstable, burning platform while managing the weapon's violent recoil and aiming with precision sufficient to stop a company-sized attack. For the next hour, Murphy operated the heavy machine gun with extraordinary effectiveness, his fire so accurate and sustained that the German advance ground to a halt. Throughout the engagement, he maintained telephone contact with supporting artillery units, calling in fire missions dangerously close to his own position. The combination of his direct machine gun fire and the artillery he directed created what military analysts would later describe as a perfect example of integrated defensive fires. Private First Class Anthony Abramsky, watching from the woods, later testified to Murphy's incredible performance. "I saw Lieutenant Murphy climb on top of the burning tank destroyer while bursts of machine gun fire were crackling all around. Pistol fire from the advancing infantry battered against the hull and track. It was the greatest display of guts and courage I have ever seen." The environmental conditions made Murphy's stand even more remarkable than it appeared to distant observers. The frozen ground had prevented proper entrenchment, leaving the attacking Germans without cover as they advanced across the open field. Visibility varied as overcast skies occasionally cleared, creating periods where Murphy could engage targets at maximum range, followed by intervals where smoke and weather limited engagement distances. The extreme cold-affected weapon, performance metal, became brittle, lubricants thickened, and the human body's ability to perform fine motor skills was severely degraded. Murphy's position on the M10 provided several critical advantages that he exploited with tactical brilliance. The tank destroyer sat at a slight elevation, overlooking the German approach route, giving him commanding fields of fire that allowed engagement at maximum weapon range. The burning vehicle's smokescreen made it difficult for German forces to target him accurately, while providing concealment that allowed him to shift positions slightly when enemy fire became too concentrated. The German forces found themselves facing an impossible tactical situation. Their tanks, designed to provide fire support for advancing infantry, discovered they could not advance without the infantry protection that Murphy was systematically destroying. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized combined arms, operations tanks and infantry working together to overcome defensive positions. But Murphy's devastating fire had broken the coordination essential to such tactics. Sergeant Elmer Broley, observing from the wood's edge through binoculars, watched Murphy's methodical destruction of the German attack. The German infantrymen got within 10 yards of Lieutenant Murphy, who killed them in the drawers, in the meadows, in the woods, wherever he saw them. This was random firing or suppressive fire designed to keep enemy heads down. Murphy was engaging individual targets with the precision of a master marksman, each burst carefully aimed and controlled. Technical Sergeant Morris Wald, observing from the battalion command post through field glasses, later testified to Murphy's incredible accuracy under the most adverse conditions. Murphy's fire was incredibly effective. He wasn't just spraying bullets. Every burst was aimed. He was picking off German infantry like he was at a shooting gallery. I saw him cut down an entire squad that was trying to flank our position. The psychological impact of Murphy's stand extended far beyond its tactical effectiveness. German forces, particularly elite units like the mountain troops attacking Holtzwihr, had developed an expectation of success based on years of victorious campaigns. They had fought across Norway, Finland, and the Eastern Front, accumulating a combat record that justified confidence in their ability to overcome American resistance regardless of the odds. What they encountered at Holtzwihr challenged fundamental assumptions about American fighting capability. The Nazi propaganda machine had consistently portrayed American soldiers as soft, undisciplined troops who would collapse under pressure from superior German forces. Instead, they found themselves stopped cold by a single American soldier who seemed immune to fear, fatigue, and the basic human instinct for self-preservation. At approximately 1,500 hours, after 40 minutes of continuous firing, Murphy's situation became critical. His ammunition was running low. The machine gun barrel was glowing red from overheating, and the burning tank destroyer beneath him was settling into the ground as its tracks and road wheels melted from the intense heat. German infantry had worked their way to within 10 yards of his position, close enough that individual soldiers could be seen preparing grenades for assault on his position. Private Charles Owen, watching from the woods, recalled the desperate final minutes of Murphy's stand. We could hear the Lieutenant S-50 starting to slow down. He was running out of ammo. Some of the Germans must have figured it out too, because they started rushing forward. Murphy grabbed his carbine and started picking them off with that, at approximately 15-10 hours, with his ammunition nearly exhausted and German infantry closing to assault distance. Murphy made what may have been the most desperate tactical decision in American military history. He called for artillery fire directly on his own position, ordering the supporting batteries to shell the area around the burning tank destroyer where he was making his stand. Lieutenant Walter Weisbenning, the forward observer coordinating artillery support, initially refused the order, understanding that it meant almost certain death for Murphy. But Murphy's response demonstrated the cold calculation that had characterized his entire combat career. "I'm giving you a direct order. Fire on my position now." The first shells landed within 50 yards of the burning tank destroyer, their explosions throwing frozen earth and deadly shrapnel in all directions. German infantry caught in the open were torn apart by the barrage, but Murphy, exposed on top of the vehicle, was also within the impact zone. Shrapnel tore through his leg, his second wound of the day, but he continued firing the few rounds he had remaining. The combination of Murphy's direct fire and the artillery barrage broke the German attack completely. The surviving infantry, perhaps 100 men from the original force of 250, began falling back toward Holtzwihr in what German records would later describe as disorganized retreat. The tanks, without infantry support and facing increasingly accurate artillery fire, reversed course and withdrew to positions beyond effective engagement range. At approximately 15-20 hours, after 1 hour of continuous combat against overwhelming odds, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy climbed down from the burning M10 tank destroyer. His uniform was scorched from heat, blood ran down his leg from shrapnel wounds, and behind him the tank destroyer continued to burn, finally exploding 10 minutes after he abandoned it in a detonation that could be felt a mile away. The battlefield before him told the story of what military historians would later call one of the most remarkable individual actions in warfare. German bodies lay scattered across the snow-covered field. Estimates suggest 50 dead, with many more wounded, from an elite unit that had never known defeat. Murphy walked back to the woodline, where his surviving soldiers waited, and according to Private Abramsky, his demeanor was characteristic. He was calm, scary calm. He asked if we had any casualties from the artillery, made sure everyone was okay, then sat down and lit a cigarette like nothing had happened. His hands weren't even shaking.